Hey everyone, this is Mr. Wistar again. In this fairly short lesson, we're going to talk about inner classes and how they might be useful in your programming. We'll talk about what an inner class is, and then we'll talk about the different types of syntax that you can use with inner classes depending on how you want to include them in your program. So what's an inner class? Well, as its name suggests, it's actually a class that you put inside of another class. That brings with it some special privileges, but also some restrictions. On the one hand, an inner class can access any of the private data of the class that contains it without needing any special methods or anything else. It can treat the data of the outer class as if it was its own. And you'll see that usually that's one of the big reasons why having an inner class is helpful. But on the other hand, because it's an inner class, it really is bound up inside of the class that it lives inside. If you're going to use an inner class, you shouldn't expect that other classes in your application are going to be able to access that or use it, unless you provide a special way in to get at an object of that inner class. But generally speaking, you're not going to instantiate them anywhere but inside of the class that contains it. So we talked about this a little bit already, but there are some pretty good reasons why, admittedly, not a lot, but there are some cases where having inner classes becomes really helpful. One reason is that you have two classes that are very tightly coupled. They really depend totally on each other. And you have a class which is sort of like a helper class that you don't want any other part of your program to be able to use. Say you wanted to take a whole bunch of functionality for a class and package it up inside of its own class, but you didn't want another class to be able to access it. You could put that in an inner class and it would still be organized the way you wanted it to, but it would only be accessible to objects of that class. The other big reason, which we've already seen examples of when we were doing mouse input, and we'll see more examples of today with keyboard input, is when you need that inner class to be able to access the data of the outer class. I mean, think about how mouse handlers work. What they do is they have methods that get called when the mouse buttons get pushed. Usually they need to modify the data of the class that contains them, which is the application. And so the only real way to do that elegantly is to use an inner class. There's two flavors of inner classes that your book describes, so we should probably go over both of them. One is you can actually put an inner class inside of a method, which sounds pretty crazy, but it actually works. If you put a class inside of your method, then it can only access data and variables that are accessible inside that method. So if you create a class inside main, it's only going to be able to access local variables that you create inside main. This is for when you have functionality. It's like when you need a class on the fly only for inside that method, and you need it to be able to work with the data that's inside that method. It's kind of an obscure programming technique, and so we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. The more common way that you use inner classes when you think about them is to declare them outside of a method but inside of the outer class. So we're going to declare the class as private. That's really important in order to protect it from being used by other classes. And again, all those restrictions that we talked about apply. You can only access objects of this class of the inner class from inside the methods of the outer class, but the inner class can access any of the data of the outer class without needing to call any accessor methods or anything like that. So let's see an example of that. In this program, we're going to take a look at how to actually handle keyboard input in your Java applets. What you'll see here's an example of a Java application. This is standard code that we're used to seeing. But when we go into the inner class, when we go into the component class, what you'll see is that in order to handle keyboard input, we have to have some class somewhere that implements the interface called keyListener. Remember that for mouse events, you have to implement mouse listener. Well, this is the equivalent for keyboard. It's an interface called KeyListener, and just like MouseListener, it comes with a set of required methods. So here's that inner class. Notice that the class is private and that it implements KeyListener, and then there's 3 methods that we have to be sure to implement for the interface. One is called KeyPressed, one is called KeyReleased, and one is called KeyTyped. And those are analogous, if you want to think about it, to MousePressed, MouseReleased, and MouseClicked. I happen to prefer MousePressed because that's the one that you can guarantee will happen when the user touches the keyboard. KeyTyped is a little it's a little more twitchy. If the user doesn't let go of the key fast enough, then that event might not actually happen. So KeyPressed is usually the one that I go with. Just like MouseListener, KeyListener comes with a parameter type called KeyEvent. You can look in the API if you want to see what the parameters are for this, but it's a key event and it's got methods in it that allow you to kind of look at what key got pushed. If you call getKeyChar, you're going to get back a character variable corresponding to that letter on the keyboard. And if it's a special character like an arrow or one of those alt commands, things like that, there are ways to handle that. If you look in the KeyEvent class in the KeyListener interface, you can see how that works. In this case, though, getting back to kind of what's going on here, in our paintComponent method, we have x and we have x and y class variables that are representing the position of a rectangle on the screen. And so every time we paint the applet, we clear it and then we draw a rectangle at those coordinates. So in our KeyPressed method, what we're going to do is we're going to check to see what letter got pushed. We're going to use the WASD commands in this program. So W is up, S is down, A is left, D is right. So all we're going to do in our KeyPressed method is we're going to modify those class variables and then call repaint. So if the user pushes D, for example, we're going to add 5 to the X coordinate. And that means when we go to repaint and redraw it, that has the effect of moving it to the right. A couple other things that you need to know when you're handling keyboard events and inner classes. Just like with adding MouseListener, you have to add KeyListener. So we're going to add KeyListener and then we're going to instantiate the inner class right here. And we do that inside the constructor. And the other thing you have to make sure that you do inside paintComponent is call this command requestFocus. What that does is it tells this component of our application to grab the keyboard, meaning anytime the user touches any keys, those events are all going to get sent to this class. Otherwise, none of your keyboard events are actually going to run. So let's see what happens when we run that. It's pretty cool. Here's our little applet, and when I use the WASD commands, they get passed to my inner class, which has the effect of making my rectangle move itself around on the screen. So in this lesson we talked about inner classes. We talked about how you create them inside of an outer class and that they can then access the data of the outer class in order to modify it depending on what you need. And it really creates a very tightly coupled relationship, so you should use it very carefully. Thanks so much.